In the crisp autumn of 2014, 11-year-old Ethan Miller vanished. One moment he was a flash of a red jacket, riding his bicycle down a sun-dappled suburban street. The next he was gone. He was an echo in an empty cul-de-sac, a ghost on a missing person poster that slowly faded in the rain. The investigation was exhaustive, a maelstrom of community fear and police diligence that churned for months before slowing to a grim, silent halt. Detective James Corbin had led that investigation, and its failure had settled deep in his bones, a cold, permanent weight. Every theory, from a runaway scenario to a tragic abduction, led to a dead end, a frayed thread that snapped in his fingers. The bike was found in a ditch a week later, untouched. There was no ransom note, no witnesses, no struggle. Ethan Miller had simply been erased from the world. The case file, thick with fruitless leads and hollow interviews, was eventually boxed up and moved to the cold case archives, a monument to a question that had no answer. For 10 years, that box, and the ghost of the boy, haunted Corbin's career and his quiet, solitary nights. The world moved on, the Millers aged with a grief that hollowed out their faces, and the red jacket on the poster became a local legend. The case went cold, frozen in time like the boy's smiling school picture. But 10 years later, on a Tuesday night thick with the smell of impending rain, the past came knocking. Literally. The sound was timid at first, a soft, hesitant rap against the solid oak of Corbin's front door. He was in his armchair, the glow of a desk lamp illuminating the pages of a book he wasn't reading, the silence of his small house a familiar companion. He wasn't expecting anyone. He lived alone, a quiet life carved out of the wreckage of a failed marriage that had been another casualty of the Miller case. He set the book down, his joints protesting as he rose. The knock came again, a little more insistent this time. He moved through the dimly lit hallway, the floorboards groaning under his weight, and peered through the peephole. He saw nothing but the distorted image of his porch light. With a sigh of irritation, assuming it was neighborhood kids, he unlatched the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Standing on his doormat, soaked from a light drizzle that had just begun to fall, was a boy. He was small, slender, with wide, terrified eyes and a mop of brown hair plastered to his forehead. He was wearing a thin red windbreaker, jeans, and sneakers that looked brand new. Corbin's breath hitched in his throat. His heart, which he thought had grown numb and slow with age, hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The world seemed to tilt, the edges of his vision blurring. It was impossible. It was a cruel trick of the light, of a mind steeped too long in regret. But the boy didn't vanish. He just stood there, shivering, his face a perfect, porcelain mask of confusion. It was the face from the poster. It was the face that stared back at him from the cold case file photos. It was the face of Ethan Miller, unchanged by a single day. The boy looked up at him, his voice a small, fragile thing in the vast, dark night. "I'm lost," he whispered. "Can you help me?" Detective James Corbin stared at the ghost on his doorstep. The ghost who claimed he was 11 years old. And looking at him, Corbin knew, with a certainty that defied all logic and reason, that the boy was telling the truth. The decade-long winter of the cold case had just ended with a thunderclap. Corbin's mind, trained for decades to process facts and evidence, had ground to a complete halt. It was a system crash, a blue screen of utter, confounding impossibility. He stood there for a long moment, the cool night air washing over him, the boy shivering on his porch. His first instinct, the one born of procedure and training, was to treat this as a hoax, a disturbed child, or a runaway with a stunning resemblance. But his second instinct, the one that had made him a good detective, the gut feeling that operated on a deeper, more primal level, screamed at him. This was real. He ushered the boy inside, his movements stiff and automatic. "Come in, get out of the rain," he said, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. The boy, Ethan, stepped over the threshold, his sneakers silent on the hardwood floor. He looked around the small living room with wide, unblinking eyes, taking in the shelves of books, the worn leather armchair, the faint smell of old paper and coffee. He didn't seem to recognize anything. Corbin closed the door, shutting out the night and sealing himself in with the paradox. "What's your name?" Corbin asked, his voice gentle, trying to keep the tremor out of it. "Ethan," the boy said. "Ethan Miller." He spoke the name as if it were a simple fact, like the color of the sky. He offered no more. Corbin led him to the armchair and draped a thick wool blanket over his small shoulders. The boy sank into the cushions, looking even smaller. "Are you hungry? Thirsty?" Ethan shook his head, his gaze distant. "I was in a room," he said suddenly, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "It was all white. And cold. There were no windows. Corbin knelt in front of him, his eyes level with the boy's. What do you remember before the room, Ethan? The boy's brow furrowed in concentration. He was quiet for so long that Corbin thought he wouldn't answer. I was riding my bike, he said finally. Red. It was a new bike. I was going to my friend's house. And then a van. A white van. The detail aligned perfectly with the original, fruitless search for a white van scene in the area. But that was 10 years ago. What happened after the van? Corbin pressed, his heart pounding. I don't know, Ethan whispered, his eyes filling with tears for the first time. Just the room. It was always just the room. And then I was walking. In the dark. And I saw your light on. The story was fractured, impossible, yet delivered with a chilling sincerity. Corbin's mind raced. He had to make the calls, but who would believe him? He could already hear the dismissal, the professional concern for his mental state. He took a deep breath. Protocol first. He called the main precinct line. This is Detective Corbin, Shield 714. I need you to run a name for me. Miller, Ethan. Date of birth, October 5th, 2003. There was a pause on the other end. Detective, the dispatcher's voice came back, cautious. That name is flagged. It's the cold case. The disappearance from 2014. I know, Corbin said, his voice steady. He's with me. He's here. At my house. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. It stretched for an eternity before the dispatcher spoke again, her tone now a mixture of shock and confusion. Detective, can you repeat that? While he waited for the hurricane he had just unleashed to make landfall, Corbin examined the boy more closely. The red windbreaker was pristine, not a scuff or a stain on it. The jeans were clean, the sneakers unscuffed. It was as if he'd just walked out of a department store. Reaching out, Corbin said, Ethan, can I see what's in your pockets? The boy nodded numbly and emptied them. A crumpled tissue, a piece of lint, and a small, heavy object that clinked as it hit the coffee table. It was a coin, but not like any coin Corbin had ever seen. It was made of a smooth, dark metal that seemed to absorb the light. It was perfectly circular, with no markings on one side and a complex, swirling geometric pattern etched into the other. It felt cold to the touch. Unnaturally so. It was the first piece of physical evidence in a decade. An anomaly. Just then his phone buzzed. It was his captain, Matthews. The storm had arrived. The call with Captain Matthews was exactly as Corbin had anticipated, a cyclone of disbelief, suspicion, and thinly veiled concern for his sanity. James, what the hell is this? Matthews' voice crackled with static and indignation. The dispatcher sounds like she's seen a ghost. You have a kid at your house claiming to be Ethan Miller? After 10 years? He's not claiming, Frank. It's him, Corbin stated, his voice a low, firm line against the captain's bluster. I was the lead on that case for 2 years. I spent hundreds of hours with the family. I stared at his face on those posters until it was burned into my memory. It's him. And he hasn't aged a day. There was a heavy sigh on the other end of the line. Okay, James. Okay. A squad car is on its way to you. And I'm calling the Millers. God help us all if this is some kind of sick joke. Corbin hung up, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He looked over at Ethan, who had fallen into a light, uneasy sleep in the armchair, the wool blanket pulled up to his chin. He looked like any other child, peaceful and innocent, yet he was a walking, breathing impossibility. The first uniformed officers arrived minutes later, their faces a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. They saw the boy and their professional composure faltered. They had all heard the stories of the Miller case, the department's great failure. Seeing the face from the old bulletins, alive and breathing in their retired colleague's living room, was a shock to the system. The paramedics who followed were equally stunned, their initial examination revealing a healthy but bewildered 11-year-old boy. His vitals were normal. There were no signs of malnourishment or abuse. He was, by all initial medical accounts, a perfectly normal child. Then the Millers arrived. Corbin intercepted them at the door, trying to prepare them, but there are no words to prepare a parent for the sight of their long-lost child returned from the dead, frozen in time. When Elaine Miller saw her son, a sound escaped her throat that was part sob, part scream. She rushed to him, her husband trailing behind her, his face a mask of stunned, joyous disbelief. The reunion was a chaotic, beautiful, and deeply confusing spectacle. They held their son, weeping, touching his face, his hair, as if to confirm he was real. But even in their overwhelming joy, the question hung in the air, unspoken and terrifying. Why was he still 11? The official investigation machine roared to life. Ethan was taken to the hospital, his parents never leaving his side. The police department became a hive of activity. Captain Matthews, his face grim, established a special task force. He put Corbin at its head, a reluctant acknowledgement that the old detective, the one haunted by this very case, was the only one who could possibly navigate this madness. In the sterile environment of a briefing room, under the hum of fluorescent lights, the initial reports trickled in, each one deepening the mystery. The DNA test was conclusive. The boy was, without a shadow of a doubt, Ethan Miller. But the medical report was where reality began to fray. A specialist, a renowned endocrinologist, delivered her findings to Corbin and Matthews via video call, her expression one of utter professional bewilderment. His biological markers are static, she explained, stumbling over her own words. We've run every test. Cellular age, bone density, hormonal development. Everything points to a prepubescent 11-year-old. It's as if his entire biological system was put on pause 10 years ago and just resumed. Medically, Captain, what I'm describing is impossible. It violates fundamental principles of biology. Matthews rubbed his temples, his skepticism warring with the undeniable scientific facts. So what are you telling us, Doctor? That he's a medical miracle? I'm telling you I don't have a medical explanation, she replied bluntly. This isn't my field anymore. This is something else. Corbin remained silent, turning the strange, cold metallic token over and over in his hand. The anomaly. The doctor's words, something else, echoed in his mind. The original theory, a simple abduction, was dead. This was no longer a standard missing persons case. They were dealing with a puzzle that logic couldn't solve. He pulled out the old Miller case files, the boxes brought up from the cold, dusty archives. The pages were yellowed, the photos faded. He was looking for a new thread, a detail that would make sense in this new, impossible context. He wasn't just looking for a man in a white van anymore. He was looking for someone who could stop time. Corbin sequestered himself in a small, windowless office, the old Miller case files spread across a large table like an archaeological dig. The smell of aging paper and stale coffee filled the air. He was a man adrift in a sea of 10-year-old facts, searching for a landmark that pointed toward an impossible future. The original investigation had been thorough, a masterclass in conventional police work. They had checked every registered white van in a 50-mile radius. They had interviewed every known offender. They had dredged lakes and combed through miles of forest. They had found nothing. But now Corbin wasn't looking for conventional clues. He was looking for the unconventional, the strange, the hint of something else the doctor had mentioned. He focused on Ethan's life in 2014. His friends, his school, his hobbies. He was a normal kid. He played soccer, he collected comic books, he was part of an after-school science club at the Northwood Community Center. Corbin's eyes stopped on that detail. The community center. He remembered it vaguely. A clean, modern building that had been a hub for local kids. He flipped through the interview transcripts. Ethan's parents, Robert and Elaine Miller. He needed to see them again, to ask the old questions with a new, terrifying understanding. He drove to their house, the same suburban home where the nightmare had begun. The media circus was already camped out on the lawn, a horde of vultures with cameras and microphones. Corbin pushed through them, his face a granite mask of authority. Inside, the house was quiet, but the air was thick with a strange mixture of elation and profound anxiety. Robert and Elaine Miller looked 10 years older, the lines of grief on their faces now competing with new lines of confusion. Ethan was sitting on the couch, watching a cartoon on a sleek, flat-screen television that would have looked like science fiction to him just days ago. He seemed small and out of place in his own home, a visitor from another era. "Detective," Elaine said, her voice trembling. "Thank you. For everything." "We're not done yet, Mrs. Miller," Corbin said gently. "I need to ask you some questions again. About the weeks leading up to before." They sat at their kitchen table, the same table where he'd broken the news to them that the active search was being scaled back all those years ago. "The community center," Corbin began. "Ethan spent a lot of time there." "The science club." Robert nodded. "He loved it. They had amazing equipment. Computers, microscopes, things the school couldn't afford. It was all donated." "Donated by who?" Corbin asked, his pen poised over his notebook. "The Finch Foundation," Elaine answered immediately. "Dr. Alastair Finch. He's a local benefactor, a very generous man. He funded the whole renovation of the center a few years before Ethan, before." The name struck a chord in Corbin's memory, but he couldn't place it. A philanthropist. A respected community figure. Did you ever meet him? Dr. Finch? Corbin pressed. Once, I think, Robert said, his brow furrowed in thought. At a fundraiser for the center. He was professional. Very intelligent. A bit distant, maybe. He talked about the importance of fostering young minds, giving them the tools to succeed. Corbin felt a faint, cold tingle at the back of his neck. Intuition. It was just a name, a thread. But it felt different. Was he a medical doctor? A scientist, I think, Elaine said. Genetics, or something like that. He retired from his research company years ago to focus on his charity work. Everyone in town respects him. A retired geneticist funding a youth center with high-end science equipment. A man described as distant. It was thin, practically non-existent. But in a case with no leads, a thin thread was a lifeline. I want to go back to the day Ethan disappeared, Corbin said, his gaze steady. Was there anything unusual? Anything at all, no matter how small. The Millers exchanged a look, the shared pain of reliving that day evident in their eyes. No, Elaine whispered. It was a normal day. He had his science club meeting. He was excited about it. He said they were starting a new project. What kind of project? He didn't say, Robert interjected. Just that it was a special project, and that Dr. Finch himself was going to be there to talk to them. Ethan was thrilled. He thought Dr. Finch was a genius. The tingle in Corbin's neck turned into an icy chill. Dr. Finch. At the science club. On the day Ethan vanished. It was a detail that had been mentioned in the original report, but dismissed as irrelevant. A philanthropist visiting his own charity. It was nothing, but now it was everything. He knew his next stop. He had to meet the generous, respected, and distant Dr. Alastair Finch. Dr. Alastair Finch's office was located not in a sterile corporate building, but in a restored Victorian mansion that housed the headquarters of the Finch Foundation for Youth Advancement. The opulence was understated but clear. Polished mahogany, antique furniture, and walls adorned with photos of smiling children and plaques of civic appreciation. It was a carefully constructed facade of benevolence. Corbin was kept waiting for precisely 7 minutes in a plush leather chair before a polite assistant showed him into Finch's study. The room was magnificent, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes on genetics, biology, and philosophy. A large window overlooked a manicured garden. Dr. Finch himself stood by that window, a tall, impeccably dressed man in his late 60s with silver hair and eyes the color of a winter sky. He turned as Corbin entered, a polite, practiced smile on his face. Detective Corbin, he said, his voice smooth and cultured. Thank you for coming. A terrible, and yet wondrous, situation with the Miller boy. A true medical enigma. That's one word for it, Doctor, Corbin said, taking the offered seat opposite Finch's imposing desk. He placed the small, metallic token on the polished wood between them. We're hoping you might be able to shed some light on it. Finch's smile didn't falter, but Corbin, a master at reading micro-expressions, saw it. A flicker. A momentary tightening around the eyes as he glanced at the object, so quick it was almost subliminal. It was a flicker of recognition, instantly suppressed. I can't imagine how, Finch said, gesturing vaguely at the token. I'm a biologist, detective, not an archaeologist. And I've been retired from active research for over a decade. I'm just a humble philanthropist now. Your humility is well known, Doctor, Corbin said, his tone flat. So is your expertise in genetics and cellular biology. Ethan's doctors are baffled. They say his cellular development was arrested. Halted. Does that sound scientifically plausible to you? Finch leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. He adopted the air of a patient professor explaining a complex concept to a slow student. Plausible? In the strictest sense, no. It would violate what we know about cellular senescence. However, nature is full of anomalies. Certain species of jellyfish can revert to a polyp stage, essentially resetting their aging process. There are theories of cryptic preservation, perhaps some unknown environmental factor. It's fascinating, from a theoretical standpoint. He was smooth, his explanations weaving a web of complex scientific jargon that was designed to sound authoritative and dismissive at the same time. He was offering plausible deniability wrapped in a lecture. Ethan was a member of the science club at the Northwood Center, which your foundation generously supports, Corbin continued, steering the conversation back on course. His parents said you were scheduled to visit the club on the day he disappeared. Was I? Finch feigned a thoughtful pause. Yes, I believe I was. I made it a point to visit the programs I funded, to see the good work in action. It's so important to inspire the next generation. Do you remember the visit? Vaguely, Finch said with a slight shrug. It was 10 years ago, Detective. I remember talking to the children about DNA, the building blocks of life. They were bright, inquisitive. The Miller boy. I can't say I recall him specifically. There were many children. He was a wall of polished respectability. Every question was met with a reasonable, helpful-sounding answer that revealed nothing. But Corbin's intuition, that persistent, nagging voice, was now a deafening roar. The flicker in Finch's eyes when he saw the token was the key. It was the tell. This man was lying. This object, Corbin said, pushing the metallic token forward an inch. We found it in Ethan's pocket. He's had it with him for 10 years. Have you ever seen anything like it? Finch picked it up, his movements deliberate. He turned it over in his long, slender fingers, his expression one of mild curiosity. No, he said, placing it back on the desk. It looks like some sort of modern token. From an arcade, perhaps? Children collect all sorts of trinkets. The lie was flawless, delivered with the casual confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. Corbin knew he had nothing. No evidence, no leverage. Just a gut feeling and a flicker of an eye. Thank you for your time, Doctor, Corbin said, rising to his feet. He pocketed the token. You've been very helpful. Of course, Detective, Finch said, standing as well. I hope for the family's sake you can get to the bottom of this bizarre affair. If the Foundation can be of any assistance, please do not hesitate to ask. As Corbin walked out of the opulent mansion and back into the real world, he knew he had just met the man who had stolen 10 years of Ethan Miller's life. The hidden-in-plain-sight villain. Now he just had to prove it. He got back in his car and made a call to a trusted contact in the cybercrimes unit. I need you to do a deep dive for me, Corbin said, his voice low and urgent. On the Finch Foundation. I want everything. Financials, property holdings, personnel. Off the books. This is just for me. He was going against his captain's wishes now, operating in the shadows. But he knew with chilling certainty that the answers didn't lie in the past. They were hidden behind a wall of philanthropy in the present. The covert investigation into the Finch Foundation became Corbin's singular obsession. He worked from his quiet house, the official task force becoming a peripheral noise he tuned out. Captain Matthews wanted logical leads, conventional police work. He was pushing the theory of a sophisticated hoax, perhaps orchestrated by a relative or a bizarre cult. He couldn't wrap his mind around the impossible truth, so he was trying to bend the facts to fit a reality he understood. Corbin, however, was following his intuition, a compass pointing directly at Dr. Alastair Finch. Days turned into a week. The preliminary report from his cybercrimes contact came in, and at first, it was as pristine as Finch's public persona. The Foundation's finances were immaculate, a clean ledger of donations pouring in and grant money pouring out to dozens of youth programs, art centers, and scholarships. It was a textbook example of a model charity. Corbin felt a stab of frustration. Was his gut wrong? Had he fixated on Finch simply because he was the only anomaly in an otherwise barren landscape of clues? He was about to give up for the night when his eyes caught a recurring line item under miscellaneous expenditures. It was a massive, consistent payment, wired monthly to a holding company he'd never heard of, Eternum Properties LLC. The payments were labeled simply storage and maintenance. The amount was astronomical for a storage fee, far exceeding what a charitable foundation would reasonably spend to warehouse old files or furniture. Corbin's heart began to beat faster. He ran the holding company's name through the county property database. Eternum Properties LLC owned a single piece of real estate, a large, isolated parcel of land about 30 miles outside the city, in a sparsely populated area of rolling hills and dense woods. The property contained a single structure, the old, decommissioned Blackwood Ridge Medical Clinic, which had been shut down by the state 15 years ago due to funding cuts and its remote location. Storage. A decommissioned medical clinic was an odd choice for a storage facility. Corbin pulled up the satellite images. The clinic was a low, sprawling brick building, surrounded by a high chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. The parking lot was empty and cracked, weeds growing through the asphalt. From the outside, it looked exactly like what it was supposed to be, abandoned, decaying, forgotten. But why would Finch's model charity be pouring millions of dollars into maintaining a derelict building in the middle of nowhere? The pieces began to click into place with a terrifying, sickening logic. Ethan's fragmented memory of a white room. Finch's expertise in cellular biology. The impossible medical reports. A secluded, abandoned clinic. It was the perfect place to hide a secret. This was it. This was the White Room. This had to be where Finch conducted his real work. He presented his findings to Captain Matthews, laying out the financial trail, the strange property holding, and his theory connecting it to Finch and Ethan Miller. Matthews listened, his face a stony mask of skepticism. "James, this is a reach," the captain said, shaking his head. "It's a storage facility. Maybe he's a doomsday prepper. Maybe he's storing expensive art. There could be 100 rational explanations. You have nothing concrete to tie Finch to a crime. All you have is a hunch and some creative accounting. We can't get a warrant based on that. The man is a pillar of this community. The political and legal fallout would be catastrophic if you're wrong." Corbin knew he was right. "Then I'll go myself," Corbin said, his voice firm. "I'll do a drive-by. A preliminary recon." "Off the books," Matthews warned, his eyes hard. "If you get caught trespassing on the property of one of this city's most influential men, this department will not back you up. You'll be on your own, James. This is your career you're gambling with." "It was my career to gamble with the day that boy showed up on my doorstep," Corbin replied. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, Corbin drove his unremarkable sedan out of the city, the urban glow fading in his rearview mirror. The county roads became narrower, darker. He turned onto a gravel access road marked with a faded, rusted no trespassing sign. He killed his headlights and coasted the last 100 yards, pulling the car into a thicket of trees. Through the branches, he could see it. The Blackwood Ridge Medical Clinic. It was a dark silhouette against the starless sky, silent and imposing. The chain-link fence was formidable. The place looked dead, but Corbin's instincts told him otherwise. There was a stillness about it that felt wrong, not the stillness of abandonment, but the stillness of a predator waiting in ambush. He got out of his car, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the soft crunch of gravel under his feet. He had a high-powered flashlight, a lock-picking kit, and the heavy weight of a decade-old promise to a boy named Ethan Miller. He was going in. The chain-link fence was old but sturdy, the barbed wire at the top glinting faintly in the starlight. Corbin found a section near a large oak tree, where the ground had eroded slightly, giving him just enough slack to work with. Using a pair of bolt cutters from the trunk of his car, he snipped a low section of the fence, peeling it back just enough to squeeze through. He moved across the cracked asphalt of the parking lot like a phantom, his body low, every sense on high alert. The main entrance was sealed tight, the glass doors reinforced with steel bars. He circled the building, his flashlight beam cutting a narrow path through the darkness, searching for a weakness. He found it in the back, a small service entrance, its steel door rusted but solid. The lock was an old, industrial tumbler, the kind he'd seen 1,000 times. His lock-picking tools felt familiar in his hands. The tumblers clicked, one by one, the sound deafeningly loud in the oppressive silence. Finally, with a soft thud, the bolt slid free. He pushed the door open a crack and was met with a gust of cold, sterile air. It smelled like antiseptic and something else, something chemical and faint, like ozone. It was the smell of a place that was not abandoned. He slipped inside, closing the door behind him, and was plunged into absolute darkness. He switched on his flashlight, the beam revealing a long, dusty corridor lined with peeling paint and forgotten medical charts scattered across the floor. This was the public face of the clinic, the part that was meant to look derelict. He moved cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. He passed empty examination rooms, a decaying nurse's station, and a pharmacy where vials of expired medicine lay shattered on the ground. Everything was as it should be, a perfect picture of decay. But the smell persisted, and the air remained unnaturally cold. His intuition screamed that he was missing something. He reached what should have been the end of the building, a large storage room filled with rotting cardboard boxes and rusted metal shelves. A dead end. He swept his flashlight across the room, frustrated. His beam caught on the far wall. It was made of concrete blocks, just like the others, but a section of it looked newer. The mortar lines were cleaner, the blocks a slightly different shade of gray. He ran his hand over the surface. It was smooth, seamless. He pushed against it. Nothing. He began, tapping along the wall, listening. Tap, tap, thud. Tap, tap, thud. Then near the floor, his knuckles hit a section that produced a hollow, resonant boom. He knelt, examining the base of the wall. Hidden behind a loose piece of baseboard, he found it, a small, flush-mounted keypad, dark and inert. He thought of the token. The strange geometric pattern. Could it be a key? He pulled it from his pocket. It didn't fit any slot. Then he thought of Finch, a man of science, of numbers. What would his password be? He tried common combinations, dates. Nothing. Then he remembered the name of the holding company. Eternum. Latin. For eternity. He thought of the foundation's name, for youth advancement. He thought of Ethan, frozen at age 11. He typed in the date of Ethan's disappearance. 10252014. The keypad lit up with a soft green glow. With a low hiss of hydraulics, a section of the concrete wall slid silently sideways, revealing a brightly lit corridor beyond. The air that washed over him was now intensely cold and sterile. The contrast was staggering. He had stepped from a decaying ruin into the future. The hallway was gleaming white, the floors polished to a mirror shine, the light from recessed panels in the ceiling casting no shadows. It was the White Room. He drew his service weapon, his heart hammering in his chest. He moved down the corridor, his rubber-soled shoes squeaking on the pristine floor. The hallway opened into a vast, circular chamber. And what he saw stole the breath from his lungs. The room was a laboratory, more advanced than anything he had ever seen. Gleaming chrome machines hummed with quiet power. Computer monitors displayed complex biological data streams and scrolling lines of code. And arranged in a circle in the center of the room were 6 sleek, coffin-like pods made of frosted glass and steel. 5 of the pods were dark and empty. The 6th was active. A pale, ethereal blue light emanated from within, illuminating the fluid inside. Floating in that liquid, suspended in a state of perfect preservation, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 9 years old. Her eyes were closed, her face peaceful. She was wearing a pink dress. Corbin recognized her instantly from a missing person bulletin that had crossed his desk 5 years ago. Amelia Vance. Vanished from a park not 20 miles from where Ethan was taken. He approached the pod, his hand trembling as he placed it on the cold glass. On a computer terminal next to the pod, a file was open. The title read, Subject 02, A. Vance. Stasis cycle, 1825. Status nominal. Subject 02. That meant Ethan was Subject 01. He began to search the rest of the lab, his rage a cold, hard knot in his stomach. He found a refrigerated storage unit containing neatly labeled genetic samples. He found detailed research notes, bound in black leather, outlining Finch's monstrous work. It was all there, his theory of temporal stasis, his obsession with halting the aging process at its point of cellular perfection, just before the onset of puberty. He saw children not as people, but as pristine biological specimens, perfect canvases for his twisted quest for immortality. In a drawer beneath the main console, he found a velvet-lined tray. It was filled with dozens of the same metallic token he had found in Ethan's pocket. They were keys, data chips, markers for each subject. He had it all. The proof, the lab, the victims. He pulled out his phone to call for backup, his thumb hovering over the screen. But a soft chime from the main entrance of the lab stopped him cold. A motion sensor. Someone was coming. He heard the whisper of the hidden door sliding open. Alistair Finch had come to check on his work. Corbin didn't have time to hide. The lab was an open, sterile amphitheater of gleaming surfaces, offering no cover. He flattened himself against the cold steel of an equipment rack, his weapon held tight in a two-handed grip, his breathing shallow. He heard the soft, confident footsteps approaching. Alistair Finch entered the laboratory, his posture relaxed, humming a soft classical tune. He wasn't expecting an intrusion. This was his sanctuary, his cathedral of science. He carried a small tablet, his gaze fixed on it as he walked toward the central console. He didn't see Corbin at first. He stopped beside the active stasis pod, a faint, proprietary smile on his lips as he looked at the floating form of Amelia Vance. Status nominal, he murmured to himself, tapping on the screen. Perfect stasis. A flawless specimen. It was the cold, clinical detachment in his voice that made Corbin's blood run cold. This wasn't a man. It was a monster wearing a human suit. It's over, Finch, Corbin's voice boomed, echoing in the sterile chamber. Finch froze. He didn't jump or look startled. He simply stopped, his head slowly turning toward the sound of Corbin's voice. When his eyes met Corbin's, there was no fear. There was only annoyance. The expression of a man whose delicate, important work had been interrupted by a lesser being. Detective Corbin, Finch said, his voice as smooth and unruffled as ever. I must confess I'm impressed. I underestimated your tenacity. I had assumed my public persona was quite impenetrable. You left a trail, Corbin said, stepping out from behind the rack, keeping his gun trained on Finch's chest. You got arrogant. Finch chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Arrogance? No, detective. Confidence. In the superiority of my work. In the pathetic inadequacy of conventional minds to even conceive of what I have accomplished here. He gestured around the lab with a sweep of his hand, a gesture not of a cornered criminal, but of a proud artist revealing his masterpiece. You see a crime scene. I see the future of humanity. An end to aging, to decay, to death itself. This was the confession. Not a panicked admission, but a proud, defiant manifesto. By kidnapping children? By locking them away in these tombs? Corbin's voice was tight with rage. You call them children, Finch countered, his tone becoming condescending. I call them pioneers. They are the vessels for a gift beyond their comprehension. I chose them for their genetic purity, their cellular perfection, before the chaos of adolescence begins the long, slow march to the grave. I didn't harm them, detective. I preserved them. I saved them from the indignity of time. You stole their lives. You stole 10 years from Ethan Miller. Stole? Finch scoffed. I gifted him 10 years of perfect, suspended youth. A biological stasis you cannot even begin to comprehend. Releasing him was part of the experiment. Phase 2. To observe the long-term effects of reintegration into a chronologically advanced environment. He was a resounding success. His cells show no degradation. The clinical, remorseless recitation of his horrors was more chilling than any scream. He saw no victims, only data points. No families, only external variables. What about the others? Corbin demanded, nodding toward the empty pods. Were they all successful? A shadow crossed Finch's face for the first time, a flicker of genuine anger. Failures, he spat. Early subjects. Imperfect methodologies. The reanimation process is delicate. Their systems couldn't handle the temporal shock. A regrettable loss of data, but necessary for refining the process. He spoke of dead children, as if they were corrupted files on a hard drive. That was it. The last thread of Corbin's professional restraint snapped. He saw the faces of the Millers, the ghost of A. Boy on a missing poster, and the small, innocent face of the girl floating in the pod. You're a psychopath, Corbin said, his voice a low growl. A common diagnosis for genius, detective, Finch replied with a thin smile. He slowly placed his tablet on the console. But this is where your investigation ends. This facility is programmed for sterile contingency. The moment my biometric signature is not registered on this console for a period of 10 minutes after a security breach, a full cleansing protocol is initiated. He looked at Corbin, his eyes gleaming with a mad triumph. A thermobaric gas. Incinerates all organic material, leaves the equipment intact. There will be no evidence. No bodies. Just another unsolved mystery for a man like you to obsess over. He was trying to stall, to run out the clock. A struggle was inevitable. As Finch took a step toward a panel on the wall, Corbin lunged. He wasn't a young man anymore, but his movements were fueled by a decade of pent-up fury. He slammed into Finch, sending them both crashing to the polished floor. The tablet skittered across the room. Finch was wiry and surprisingly strong, fighting with a cold, desperate ferocity. He clawed at Corbin's face, his eyes wild. You're ruining everything, he shrieked, his mask of composure finally cracking. They rolled on the floor, a desperate ballet of violence in the heart of the sterile lab. Corbin's gun slid away. Finch's hand closed around a heavy metal tool on a nearby cart. He swung it wildly, catching Corbin on the side of the head. The room spun, stars exploding behind Corbin's eyes. Through the haze of pain, he saw Finch scrambling for the console, his fingers reaching for the keypad to manually trigger the cleansing protocol. With a final desperate surge of adrenaline, Corbin launched himself forward, tackling Finch at the waist, driving him away from the console and hard against the base of Amelia Vance's stasis pod. The glass shuddered. Just then, the sound of sirens, faint at first, then growing rapidly louder, pierced the unnatural silence of the clinic. Corbin had managed to send a one-word text to his most trusted junior officer before the confrontation. Blackwood. Backup was here. Finch heard the sirens, and his face contorted in a mask of pure hatred. It was over. His perfect, sterile world was about to be breached. As the first set of heavy boots pounded down the hidden corridor, Corbin landed a solid punch to Finch's jaw. The monster crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Corbin, gasping for breath, his head throbbing, leaned against the humming pod, the cool glass a comfort against his back. He looked from the unconscious form of the philanthropist to the preserved face of the innocent girl, and then toward the sound of his approaching colleagues. Justice, after a 10-year delay, had finally arrived. The aftermath was a controlled storm of forensic teams, flashing lights, and grim-faced officers. The Blackwood Ridge Clinic was transformed from a secret tomb into the most significant crime scene in the state's history. Dr. Alastair Finch, the celebrated philanthropist, was led away in handcuffs, his face a blank mask of defeat, his monstrous secrets exposed to the harsh glare of reality. The rescue of Amelia Vance was a delicate, hushed affair, a moment of profound hope amidst the horror. She was carefully removed from the stasis pod and rushed to the hospital. A second child returned from the void, another family's prayers answered in the most bewildering way imaginable. The full scope of Finch's depravity was slowly unveiled. The failed experiments Corbin had learned about were linked to other cold cases, the remains of at least 4 other children discovered in a sealed, incinerated chamber deep within the facility's sub-basement. Finch had been preying on children for nearly 15 years, using his foundation's youth centers as his own personal hunting ground. The news exploded, a media firestorm that consumed the city and the nation. The story of the time-frozen children and the philanthropist monster was a modern-day fairy tale turned nightmare. For Detective James Corbin, the days that followed were a blur of debriefings, reports, and reluctant press conferences. He was hailed as a hero, the tenacious cop who refused to let a cold case die. Captain Matthews, publicly eating his words, clapped him on the back and spoke of his unflinching instinct. But Corbin felt no triumph. He felt a deep, profound weariness. The weight of the last 10 years hadn't been lifted. It had simply changed shape. He had closed the case, but he couldn't erase the damage. He stood by the window in his office at the precinct, the same small, windowless room that had been his sanctuary, now feeling like a cage. He watched the rain streak down the glass of the main squad room window, washing the city clean. He thought of Ethan Miller. The boy was home, surrounded by his loving parents, but he was an exile in his own life. He was a boy from 2014 living in a world of smartphones, social media, and a history he had slept through. His friends were now young adults in their early 20s, their faces lined with the experiences of a decade he had missed. He was an anomaly, a living ghost, and his journey was just beginning. The Millers had their son back, but the son they knew was gone, replaced by this time-displaced echo. Their joy was real, but it was laced with a deep, sorrowful complexity. The road ahead for them, and for the Vances, would be long and strange, a path no one had ever walked before. A young officer, the same one he had texted from the lab, approached his door. "Detective? The Millers are here. They wanted to see you." Corbin straightened his tie and walked out to the lobby. Robert and Elaine Miller stood there, looking less haunted than the last time he'd seen them. There was a glimmer of peace in their eyes. Between them stood Ethan. He was holding a new comic book, its cover bright and glossy. He looked up at Corbin, his expression no longer one of pure confusion, but of a quiet, budding curiosity. "Thank you," Robert said, extending a hand. Corbin shook it firmly. "For not giving up on him." "I never did," Corbin said, his gaze meeting Ethan's. The boy offered a small, shy smile. It was the first one Corbin had seen. It was a fragile thing, but it was a start. It was a spark of hope in the vast darkness of what had happened. After they left, Corbin returned to his quiet house. The book was still on the table, where he'd left it that fateful night. The wool blanket was folded neatly on the armchair. The ghost was gone, replaced by a real, breathing boy facing an impossible future. Corbin had found the monster and put him in a cage. He had delivered a form of justice. But the true resolution wouldn't be found in a courtroom or a headline. It would be found in the small, quiet moments of healing for the families Finch had torn apart. It would be found in Ethan Miller learning to live in a world that had left him behind, and in the slow, painstaking process of a boy out of time finding his way home. The rain finally stopped, and through the clouds, a sliver of sunlight broke through, casting long shadows across the floor. The case was closed, but the story was far from over.